I never grew up a card shark. My dad and uncle once tried to teach me poker and other games, but the intricacies always eluded me. Eventually, I settled for solitaire, a solitary game that matched my temperament. Lauren, my wife, was the opposite, a card game enthusiast through and through. While not a professional, she was skilled and often returned from poker nights with winnings and stories to share. On this particular evening, we were at Jake and Molly's house, a cozy, welcoming home nestled on the outskirts of Nashville. The poker table was lively, filled with familiar faces: Jake, Molly, Ethan, Steve, Lucas, and Ryan. Meanwhile, I was in the living room with Alyssa and Rachel, the wives of Lucas and Ryan. We chatted about work and life, the murmur of conversation blending seamlessly with the sounds of shuffling cards and laughter from the kitchen. As the night wore on, I expected Lauren to emerge, smiling, ready to head home. Instead, a strange sound caught my attention. It wasn't the usual banter of poker players, but something more intense. My curiosity piqued. I stood and made my way toward the kitchen. What I saw when I stepped through the doorway froze me in place. Lauren, my Lauren, was kneeling in front of Ethan. His pants were partially undone, and her hand was wrapped around him. Horror surged through me as I struggled to process the scene. "Lauren, what the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my voice sharp with disbelief. Ethan scrambled back, startled, as Lauren glanced at me with a mix of frustration and desperation. Before she could respond, Steve chimed in, "Nick, relax. It's part of the game. She ran out of cash and bet something else." My stomach churned. "I don't care what kind of bet it was," I spat, my voice rising. "She's not doing this." Lauren stood, her expression resolute. "Nick, I had an unbeatable hand. I would have won. It was a gamble, and I lost. I have to honor the bet." "You don't have to do anything," I countered, my anger barely contained. "We're leaving. Now." But she didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms, her jaw set in defiance. "I can't walk away. This is more than just a game to them. It's about honor and respect. If I back out, I'll lose that." I stared at her, my heart breaking with every word. "You're prioritizing this over our marriage?" Before I could pull her away, she called for help. To my shock, the others stepped in. Lucas, Ryan, and Jake grabbed my arms, holding me back. I struggled against them, desperation fueling my attempts to break free. "Lauren, don't do this," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "We can leave. None of this matters." She glanced at me, her expression softening for a fleeting moment. But then she turned away, her resolve unshaken. "I'm sorry, Nick," she said quietly. "But I made a choice." The fight drained out of me. Defeated, I stopped struggling. The men let go, sensing my surrender. Without another word, I turned and walked out, my steps heavy with anguish. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, replaying the betrayal over and over. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I knew I couldn't stay. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt tainted. Inside, I grabbed a suitcase and began packing. My movements were mechanical, my thoughts numb. 30 minutes later, I heard the front door open. "Nick!" Lauren called out, her voice hesitant. She found me in the bedroom, my suitcase half-packed. "What are you doing? What does it look like?" I replied, my tone cold. "I'm leaving." She looked at me, incredulous. "Nick, come on. It was just a bet. You're overreacting." "Overreacting," I repeated, disbelief lacing my voice. "You betrayed me, Lauren. You chose them over us." "It wasn't like that," she insisted, exasperated. "It's just a game." Her words stung more than I thought possible. Shaking my head, I zipped up the suitcase and turned to her. "If that's how you see it, then there's nothing left to say." I walked past her, suitcase in hand, leaving behind the life we'd built together. As the door closed behind me, the weight of her choice settled on my shoulders. There would be no going back. I didn't want to do it, but I had to honor my word. It was part of the promise I made, a promise that, for me, wasn't just a trivial gesture. "It wasn't just a game, Lauren," I said, my voice trembling under the weight of emotion. "You don't get it. You humiliated me in front of everyone. Right there, in that room. You chose them over me, over us. It was just a stupid favor, Nick, she replied, rolling her eyes as if I were blowing things out of proportion. Nothing else happened. We're still together, and this shouldn't change anything. But it did. It changed everything. You chose some flimsy concept of honor over our marriage, I shouted, unable to contain the storm brewing inside me. That's not love, Lauren. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of confusion and defiance, as though she couldn't fathom why I was so hurt. Then, her arms crossed, her face hardening as she delivered her final verdict. I'm not throwing away years of friendships just because of one night, Nick. They mean a lot to me, and I won't walk away from them. Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. I zipped up my suitcase, slung a duffel bag over my shoulder, and turned to face her one last time. You don't get it, Lauren, I said quietly, my voice heavy with resignation. And I don't think you ever will. Without waiting for a reply, I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. I drove aimlessly for a while, the city lights blurring as my mind spiraled through a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. Eventually, I ended up at the River's Edge Inn, a modest, unassuming hotel we'd driven past countless times but never had cause to enter. Checking in felt surreal, the cold sterility of the room a stark contrast to the warmth of the home I'd left behind. That night, I tossed and turned, every moment from that evening replaying in my mind like a cruel, unending loop. The betrayal, the humiliation, it all cut deeper with each recollection. I couldn't understand how something we'd spent years building could crumble so quickly. The next day, I threw myself into work, desperate for any distraction. Lauren's texts and calls came through relentlessly, but I ignored them. Each message felt hollow, her apologies devoid of any real understanding. That evening, unable to face the suffocating loneliness of my hotel room, I stopped by the Crossroads Sports Bar, a lively spot known for its wings and live sports broadcasts. Nursing a drink and staring blankly at a muted game on the screen, I felt the weight of my emotions pressing down like a vice. Nick! I looked up to see Alyssa and Rachel, two of Lauren's closest friends, standing beside me, their faces etched with concern. Mind if we join you? Rachel asked gently. With a sigh, I gestured toward the booth. Sure. Not sure there's much to say, though. Alyssa hesitated before speaking. Nick, we're so sorry. We didn't know what to do. None of us expected things to play out the way they did. Didn't know what to do. I repeated bitterly, my voice sharp. You both just sat there and watched. Do you have any idea how it felt for me to stand there, begging her to stop, while you did nothing? They exchanged uneasy glances before Alyssa spoke again, her voice soft. We didn't realize what was happening at first. It felt like some sort of prank or joke that got out of hand. Got out of hand? I scoffed, shaking my head. That's putting it mildly. How would either of you feel if it was your partner humiliating you like that? Rachel nodded, looking down at her hands. You're right, Nick. If it were us, I don't know what we would have done. But we froze, and for that, we're sorry. We should have done something. You should have, I said, my voice tinged with disappointment. But it's too late now. A heavy silence settled over the table before Rachel finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Have you spoken to Lauren since that night? I shook my head, bitterness creeping into my tone. What's there to say? She doesn't even think she did anything wrong. To her, it was just a stupid bet, but to me, it was everything. She cared more about their approval than my feelings. Alyssa leaned forward, her tone cautious yet insistent. Nick, maybe you should talk to her. Give her a chance to explain, really explain herself. Maybe she's had time to reflect. Or maybe she hasn't, I replied coldly. Either way, she's already shown me where her priorities lie. And it wasn't with me. 2 days later, after hours of agonizing introspection, I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed for divorce. When Lauren received the papers, I braced myself for resistance, anger, tears, a desperate plea to make things right. But to my surprise, she signed them without so much as a fight. Her lack of effort, her silence, her complete absence of remorse, it stung more than the betrayal itself. It was as if everything we'd shared meant nothing to her. Over the following weeks, I heard from her only occasionally. Her texts were brief, generic apologies that lacked any depth or acknowledgement of what she'd done. It was clear she didn't grasp the magnitude of her actions. When the divorce was finalized, it felt both liberating and devastating. I had loved her deeply, but love couldn't mend the fractures caused by betrayal and indifference. And so, I began the long, arduous journey of piecing myself back together, alone. A second chance at forever. I thought I'd feel relief once it was official, divorce papers signed, the chapter closed. But instead, an emptiness heavier than I'd ever known settled into my chest. Despite everything, I missed her. I missed the life we had built, the laughter we shared, the countless memories that once defined our world. But I also knew there was no going back. A few days after the divorce was finalized, I found myself at the Iron Lantern, a small, dimly lit bar in Nashville where Lauren and I had shared some of our most treasured moments. It was the place where we had our first date, where I fell for her sparkling laughter and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. It was also where I had nervously dropped to one knee and asked her to marry me. Now, I sat alone, nursing my second whiskey, the weight of the past pressing down on me like an anchor. I didn't notice her approach, but her scent, a mixture of lavender and something uniquely her, was unmistakable. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. I glanced up and saw her standing there, a mix of hope and regret in her expression. My heart clenched. "No," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my tone. "Go ahead." She slid into the seat next to me. For a while, we sat in heavy silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, she broke it, her voice trembling. "Nick, I don't even know where to start." "Start with why," I said, my gaze fixed on my glass. Why was that game more important than me? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. At the time, I didn't see it that way. I got caught up in the thrill, the need to win, to feel in control. I didn't think it would cost me everything. I didn't think I'd lose you. But you did, I replied, my voice cold. And even then, you chose them over me. Her hands fidgeted on the table, her gaze downcast. After you left, I was lost. I couldn't understand why I had done what I did, so I started seeing a counselor. I looked up sharply, surprised. "A counselor?" She nodded. "An addiction specialist, actually." I didn't realize it at the time, but I was addicted to the thrill, the validation, the sense of importance I got from winning. After you left, I realized how far I'd fallen. It wasn't just poker, it was a need to prove something, even at the cost of what mattered most. Her words hit me like a wave, stirring a mix of disbelief, sadness, and a flicker of curiosity. "So, what now? Are you cured?" She shook her head, her hands still trembling. "No, not cured. Addiction isn't something that just disappears. But I've been attending meetings at Trinity Methodist Church every week. I haven't touched a card since the night you left. I'm learning to control those impulses, to face the reasons I felt so empty in the first place." I swallowed hard, her confession unraveling the anger I had carried for so long. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wanted to," she whispered. "But I wasn't ready. I had to work on myself first. I needed to understand my own flaws before I could face you. I wanted you to know that none of it was your fault. It was me, my issues, my mistakes." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I took a deep breath, unsure of what to say. Why now? Why tell me all this tonight? Tears shimmered in her eyes as she looked up at me. "Because, Nick, I still love you. I know I destroyed us, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know I'm not that person anymore. I'm trying. I'm changing. I just needed you to know." For a long moment, I stared into my glass, my heart torn. I wanted to hate her, to cling to the anger that had kept me going. But deep down, I knew the truth. I still loved her. The pain ran deep, but so did the memories, the connection we once had. She stood, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you for listening. I'll go now." As she turned to leave, a wave of finality washed over me. This was it. Her walking away would close the book on us forever. "Lauren," I called out, my voice stopping her mid-step. She turned, surprise and hope flickering in her eyes. "Yeah." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "Have you had dinner yet?" She blinked, caught off guard. No, I haven't. I gave a small, tentative smile. Then stay. Let's have one last meal together. A glimmer of hope lit up her face, and she nodded slowly. I'd like that. The journey back. What started as one last meal turned into cautious meetings, small steps toward rebuilding what was shattered. Over the next months, we took things slow, rediscovering each other and learning to trust again. On what would have been our 5th wedding anniversary, we remarried in a quiet ceremony, vowing to do things differently this time. Lauren stayed committed to her meetings, working tirelessly to overcome her struggles. She gave up poker completely, avoiding anything that could pull her back into old habits. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on honesty and effort. Each day, we found new reasons to hold on to each other, proving that even in the aftermath of betrayal, love could find a way. Would you forgive a betrayal disguised as a simple bet? Could trust ever be rebuilt after such pain? Share your thoughts. Would you have let Lauren walk away, or would you have taken a chance on love again?